Thank you again very much for coming. I know how much marking, etc., you've been all busy with, and this is, don't I know, this is the end of term, so it's really a punishment to sit here, so I'll try to make it as brief as possible. So, this gentleman you know, and if you take his, try to pronounce his name in German, it's usually Van Gogh. In English, American English, I understand is Van Gogh. In UK English, Van Gogh, or some version of UK English. The Dutch original is, of course, Van Gogh, both G and the G, two G's to begin with. If you take the thing like Darjeeling tea, for example, and the Himalayas, in Bengali, where it comes from, is Himalaya and Darjeeling, while, of course, in German and English, the stress is way towards the right, Himalayas, Darjeeling. When I was working on Bengali intonation with Bruce Hayes, he kept saying, but the stress is on the penultimate syllable. I said, no, the stress is on the first syllable. But that's what you're saying. I said, no, I'm saying Darjeeling, not Darjeeling. Anyway, it went on and on. So, essentially, it's very difficult to even perceive something if it's not in your own language, let alone say it. Things like arthritis, and it is borrowed from Romance languages, English and German. Stress is on different places. Even within the same dialect, you have Mathematik versus Mathematik, and so on and so forth. So earlier, I called attention to a characteristic of grammars called pertinacity. So a rule or pattern may persist over time, though its realization may change, and two variants of it. One being that the persistence of a particular pattern in a language, it may apply to new forms, and different outputs may emerge, same pattern, different output realization. The opposite is different pattern, same output realization. So persistence of output forms despite changes in the grammar. So you wouldn't know there was a hidden changes in the grammar, but the outputs look very much the same. So does loan adaptation affect both types of pertinacity? So when the child builds up her grammar, you may continue with A, of course, but can show effects of B, where a different grammar is built on the same data. That is entirely possible. For adults engaged in loans, the persistence of a pattern in a language may apply to new forms, and new outputs may emerge. Same pattern, different output realization. And the persistence of new forms via loans could, of course, lead to reanalysis, but I'm going to argue that perhaps this happens later. Yeah. Mind you, I'm talking about adults borrowing from languages, and later, once you've become in situations where you've become bilingual or multilingual, then the reanalysis becomes a different matter, because then it's normal language acquisition. So marked prosodic, tonal, as well as segmental contrasts persevere pertinaciously even when faced by loans. So the first example will be from metrical stress, a shift in stress in English. So a lot of you have worked on this and know it very well. And the pitch accents, the nonesuch contrast will be pitch accents, segmental adaptation in Swiss German, in Bengali from Portuguese and English, and in English via Romance and Greek. Now, the word nonesuch, I'm sure you had problems with that. But this was a familiar word for when we were young. And when we were teenagers, this was considered to be, if you have a romantic journal, I'm sure some of you have read it, a very young, handsome person coming in on a horseback, ready to fall in love with you, is supposed to be a nonesuch, right? That was essentially our examples of nonesuch. Jeff complained that he had to look up two words, and I'm sure nonesuch was probably one of them. Now, the focus here is on effect of loans in European and Indian contexts, which are, melting pots of cultural and linguistic backgrounds. Let's take Germanic to Latinate stress. Now, if you think about it, it's a huge change. You began with a stress on the stem initial syllable, left to right. Sometimes, yes, the unstressed syllables for verbs like forbiddingly, forgetting, begin, etc. And then it became Latinate stress, which is from the right. So it's left to right, it became right to left edge stress to right edge stress, yes. So Latin stress on the penultive heavy, otherwise on the antepenultive. Now, there was, of course, exposure to Latin and French in Old English and very early Middle English. these words completely followed the old pattern. So the direction was still foot direction left to right, main stress left. Loans of more than 3 syllables words increased, and so you would get things like reverence, but revere. So if they looked like verbs or derived adjectives, the stress would fall on the right edge. But that, of course, patterned with things like forget and begin, so there was no difference. So about 1570, looking at different, there was a change towards foot direction right to left. Main stress, however, still stayed very much to the left. Longer words came in, and if you have 2 feet, there was a competition, and you got but main stress still remained very much on the left. This was during the time of Levins's dictionary. So this is after Shakespeare's birth we are talking about. Now, there is an alternative claim by Halley and Kaiser, and their claim was that the Romance stress rule began right after Chaucer. So you had Old English, the William the Conqueror landed up, established themselves, and stress changed. That was basically the general idea. And the French pattern responsible for Chaucer's final stress, that was the argument, and the Latin pattern stressed on the penultimate syllable if heavy. They combined together and became Romance. The problem is, if you think about it, the French stress rule is to stress the final vowel unless it's schwa, otherwise stress the penultimate. The Latin is very different, stresses tense final vowel, that much is the same, but otherwise stress the penultimate syllable if it is heavy, and otherwise stress the antepenultimate. That stress rules differ in many cases. So for example, if I give like Abbot, Jesus, if you have these words, then the French stress would be word final, tempeste. I mean, if you pronounce them, I'm not like French, but as if they were English. If it's Latin, then it would be initial, because you would not get final stress in these cases. They would not be, that this simply wouldn't fit. So the French stress pattern, really, the early stress pattern, had no lasting effect on English prosody. So words with French stress in Chaucer could also be stressed according to the native pattern. So we had lots of doublets, like comfort, and so on. And present-day English reflexes of Romance words with French stress in Chaucer have initial stress always. So all of these words have initial stress. There was no effect of, even if you used it for metrical purposes, there was no effect of that. And in fact, if you look at disyllabic Romance loans in the 15th century, you see the stem vowel is present in present-day English: talent, barren, senate, jealous. You can just look them up. This is, of course, you have to depend on what the OED's initial entry is, but systematically you see that they are initial stress. If the stem vowel is long or short, it doesn't matter. You get exactly the same principle. How you got the long vowel, that's a different matter, but we're not interested in this. We're just talking about the stress. So around 1660, so this is about 100 years after Shakespeare, the claim is that the foot direction right to left, main stress right. Yeah. So that's quite late if you think about it. So more silent changes. One of the biggest changes is the increase in noun-verb patterns, of course, like torment, and so on. And they were systematically, if they were initially a verb, then final initial noun, not. However, even now there is a very strong tendency for English. If you have 2 feet, then there is a strong tendency to go to the left edge, yes, which does not happen in Dutch and German. Yes, you constantly go to the right edge. But if you have the rhythm rule, then clearly if you have 2 feet, it will shift. So it emerges from our analysis that both the core grammar, so foot type, quantity sensitivity, core data, remain essentially unchanged. Yeah. And the change occurred most readily in areas of grammar where the native vocabulary did not know what to do with it. Yes, and then the loan vocabulary had to provide the key evidence. And the sort of thing what happened is two things. One is the suffixes, which are very heavy, and they came in and they added behave like compounds. And so if you look at these early borrowings, if we have comparable residence, these are the early borrowings, and look at the same thing, later loans, severity, rarity, you get a different pattern. In severity, it has moved to the right edge. Yeah. So if you remember like Lieberman and Prince or early things like moving, the exceptional cases of these, Kiparsky's early work, they always refer to the early borrowings being a problem, like residence, reside, reverence, revere. These were the alternations which were problematic, but those were very early. If you looked at the later ones, you got a different pattern. So this change in turn necessitates some silent reanalysis. Yeah? So honorary was now conflicting with mathematics. So this is what you got in terms of it was not a one change right away after William the Conqueror showed up. It was quite a systematic, slow change. So what we try to, Ilan and I try to pinpoint dates. These dates are, of course, flexible and somewhat dependent on the kinds of dictionaries that were. So 1570 was Levins's dictionary, which we took. 1660, where the other orthoepists were active, and that's why that range was chosen. You found people arguing about the differences around the 1660s. Yeah. So it started very little effect for centuries, and then only gradually it was really the native speakers who changed it, reanalyzed it to go to the right edge. A more dramatic one, perhaps, are the pitch accents in the Scandinavian languages. Now, to give you a quick survey of it, this is important to do that. So the Scandinavian languages have two accents. I mean, some of them don't, like the Finnish, Swedish they have ignored the accent. But if you look at this Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, the Danish stirred is comparable to the Norwegian and Swedish. So if the Norwegian and Swedish have accent 1, Danish has the stirred, and otherwise, if they have accent 2, Danish does not have the stirred. So roughly, this is the pattern. And the contrast is always in disyllabic words. So competing hypothesis is that is any accent less predictable? Does but one of the members govern the appearance of the surface accent? Is one of them more of a nonesuch? And the three hypotheses with accent 1 is really the marked one. That's the one that's odd. That's the one that governs everything. Or accent 2, the opposite, or like accent 1 and 2. So Gösta Brusse had both, in fact, the equivalent hypotheses. But the general one that's accepted is really assuming accent 2. So how does it work? So just to give you an idea what the problem is, where the loans come in. So you have monosyllabic stems, which are always accent 1. And then when you get nice inflectional suffixes, like the infinitive, you get accent 2. And if you get plurals, this is Norwegian and Swedish both, you also get accent 2. Well, that naturally you want to think, okay, this must be the suffixes doing something over there. And it's got the accent 2 suffixes adding to this. So if you add the way it works with Thomas Riad and Gert Christoffersen is that you add the suffixes come with a high tone and they get added to it. And similarly with the plural. How about prefixes? So you look at some words like this, the infinitive, accent 2, and then you add a prefix, lo and behold, they are accent 1. Now, if the suffix carries a2, then it predicts that you ought to be, it should override it, and it should be accent 2, but it isn't. So you need repairs. What kind of repairs? Well, Christoffersen's repair was that the tonal foot had to be left, otherwise you have to fix it, and Thomas Riad's was deaccenting. So if it was not to the left, then you deaccented. However, other words show up with a tonal foot not to the left, and you should expect accent 1, but no, you get accent 2. Similarly, the other way around, if you have the foot is really to the left, and you expect accent 2, but you get accent 1. So you need further repairs. Now comes the locality constraint. The morpheme which is carrying the accent has to be close to the tonal foot. Therefore you get, so it works, but time and again you need some sort of a fixing, let's put it this way. So are we missing a generalization? So if you look at the Norwegian and the Swedish, they're all accent 1, as I've told you. There are no exceptions to this. So perhaps certain morphemes trigger accent 1 rather than accent 2. Now that makes sort of sense. So if you look at this, you have the unstressed prefixes, they look accent 1. If you have an unstressed prefix with a suffix, that looks like accent 1. Accent 2, but if the prefix is there, then it's accent 1. So it looks as if all unstressed prefixes would appear to be accent 1, irrespective of how local the accent is or how location of the tonal foot. And all these prefixes are borrowed from Middle High German. None of them are inherited from Old Norse. Now, Ben has worked on the Middle English prefixes, which disappeared. Well, Old Norse prefixes disappeared too, the unstressed ones. Yeah. And this was during the Hansa period. So imagine this is the trading going on, right? This is the North German, Middle Low German. We are talking about trading going on. Along with the trading, some prefixes went around there too. So this is I think this is a really, when I first encountered this, I couldn't believe my eyes, because it's the first classic case of loads of verbs being borrowed. Usually nouns are being borrowed, but all of these verbs. When I was looking at it, this is more than a decade ago, began to look at it, the Swedish etymological dictionary ended at S. And so I was looking for b and fer, but fer, of course, began with a V, so I was stuck. I couldn't quite locate those. Now they are out again. Now there's online, but luckily. So you get similar. This is Norwegian. You get similar patterns in Swedish, and if you look at this, you get But you also get a random collection of words which look like accent 1, like the days of the week, certain towns, words like tiger, villa, etc. So our hypothesis was, this was work with Elizabeth Jonsen-Steiner and Alison Vettelin, maybe accent 1 in certain stems and affixes have a strong present. Could that be specified? And if it is, then that governs everything. The default disyllabic trochee, you will get accent 2. So anything which has inherited from Old Norse with an accent 2 disyllabic word, it's going to get accent 2. In fact, accent 1 seems to be somewhat of a nonesuch, not a very coherent set. So one other thing to point out is that this is the clitics versus affixes. If you had a phonological clitic, which was their, the determiner, or demonstrative, which became cliticized in the Scandinavian languages, many of them had double determination now. You have, the plurals would have accent 2, but what looks like a real suffix is always accent 1. And the argument from the phonologist perspective, here everybody agrees that en or et, whichever masculine or neuter, happens to be a clitic. It is added after accent assignment. So that is the syntacticians would like to argue that that's actually a suffix, but phonologically that certainly behaves like a clitic. So one particular gain, if you think of it this way, is the following. If you have accent 2 as the lexical accent, then you separate Danish from Norwegian and Swedish. Danish stirred and Norwegian Swedish may become different in terms of their. So what you actually, if you have accent 1 as this, then you get a systematic pattern. Then the stirred and accent 1 fit together, and accent 2 is a separate set with no stirred. Yeah. Now, first of all, how stable is this? When were these things, when they were borrowed, what did it look like? Well, there was 200 years after they were borrowed we are talking about. We can look at Scandinavian life slightly earlier. Was there an awareness of this contrast? Now, Anders Nikander, 707, early 18th century, 1800s, not early, he was born early, wrote a poetic manual, and also he wrote he was a postmaster, and he considered himself a very good poet. Actually, his poems are a trifle boring, but he thought he wrote really good poetry, and he wrote about poetry. He was very big on this. Yes. So now, if you look at the edited version, you don't get all the facts. This happens all the time, right? So you need the manuscripts. So, and I'm sure in this particular center, a lot of you have had this experience. Librarians think the manuscripts belong to them. So we should have access only if one is, really. Bodleian, for example, 14th century Dutch manuscript, they considered the professor of linguistics and a Bodleian librarian to be too dangerous to look at the manuscript together. So I was allowed to look at one and not with anybody else. Who knows what I might do to it? So the librarian, of course, sat with another manuscript next to me, and we kind of looked around like this. Yes, what do you think of that clitic over there? How about that line? So, you know, really strange. This particular one, Thomas Riad was very kind, and he organized it. And, well, it required persuasion to look at this. What we found was the following. These are Nikanda's rhymes. Notice they're all accent 2 or the feminine rhymes or with accent 2 or with accent 1. Yeah? So whenever he had a plural marking with, that showed up as an accent 1 or a clitic, he would have it as accent 1, otherwise an accent 2. More interesting, he commented on this. So he said, so he would show these examples and argue that these are not good rhymes. His point was, even if segments match, these are bad rhymes because accents do not match. So Tallinn and Garland, they looked completely same, but they do not match. Yes, so that was his. But he went one step more. He said, he noticed this. He said, syllables in compounds, he called these the prefixed verbs compounds, should. Oh, sorry, there's a verb missing, have the same properties as their simplex stem. However, the unexpected do not when preceded by an unstressed prefix. So for Farah, but Farah, they should be the same, but they are not, so you mustn't use them, blah, etc. So he too had noticed this. So the same tonal opposition between the definite article behaving as a clitic and regular suffixes, and the same distribution of lexical accent in the 18th century, and the lexically specified unstressed prefixes were accent 1 during that time too. Now, why am I calling this as an unsuch? Well, Haugen already noted these. It's not that, but people did not quite want to put it into one category. He commented on this. He said, loans and other distinctive categories, which are categories belonging to the world of urban middle-class life of Norway. These were some of the words. Miscellaneous loans, and lexical unpredictable accent assigned to distinctive categories, irrespective of whether they are borrowed or inherited. Names of days, names of the months, names of berries, wines. Wines remind me of the gender distinction in German, where alcohol is usually masculine except beer, right? That's the only one which is neuter. So the gender classification. Here, accent classifies the two different categories. So lots of semantic categories, or just things like, mind you, Tuesday, Wednesday, the days of the weeks are Germanic. I mean, no, they came from Old Norse, but they are accent 1. Nouns which have umlaut plurals, so anything which is odd, an entire set of domestic products, nautical terms, they're all accent 1. Yeah. Middle High German, put that into the list, stressed and unstressed prefixes, and so on and so forth. So we are concerned with the effect of these kinds of nonesuch lexically specified words. And what about the loans? So Koch commented on the fact distinctive words and loans belong to accent 1, but he was not really interested in talking about the consequences of these. So beyond commenting on the fact that borrowed prefixes exceptionally give accent 1, or that the majority of polysyllabic loans have accent 1, the literature has basically assumed that loans have had little effect. But if we take the entire phonological system together, then it seems that the exceptional cases, morphemes or words, have the property of being entirely insensitive to accent 2 and are bundled together as accent 1. Once we assume that the nonesuch morphemes are lexically specified for accent 1, it all fits. So loans did not cause accent 1 to be lexically specified, but they were responsible for increasing the number of morphemes which trigger accent 1. So pertinacity begins with P, but as we will see in a minute, some reanalysis, but much later in Swedish. So if you look at the verbs and compare East Norwegian to Central Swedish, this is exactly parallel. Disyllabic stems with the infinitive, accent 2. Stressed prefixes inherited from Old Norse, accent 2. Unstressed prefixes, loans, accent 1, East Norwegian and Central Swedish. And here comes the difference. If you have stressed prefixes verbs, the East Norwegian are accent 1, Central Swedish accent 2. Some dialects still have accent 1 in Swedish, but Standard Swedish uses this as a compound. They are always accent 2. So if you look at the way things were borrowed, they were quite middle of the 16th century. And East Norwegian, the interesting thing is that if you have a stressed noun prefix, they are accent 2, but if it's a verb, it's accent 1. Now, why the difference? Because if you have, as I said, the verbs, stress prefixes, borrowed, stress prefixes, inherited, accent 2. Stress prefixes, borrowed, accent 1. Stress prefix, noun, accent 2. So the generalization seems to be if the noun is derived from an accent 1 verb with a nominalizing suffix, it keeps accent 1. If the noun is not derived, but most independently borrowed, then it is accent 2, just like all nouns have. So we have two pieces of evidence. Verb and noun pairs were borrowed at different times, and the differing noun-verb stress patterns of the donor language facilitated the accent assignment. So if you look at the German and the Dutch verb, you can see, so umkommen, anmelden, was like melden an and rufen, so ich ruf mich später or something. You would get the prefix, of course, particle moving to the right edge. Those were the ones that came in. Mind you, in Norwegian and Swedish, they don't move. They are inseparable. They are just joined there. In Norwegian, they would be accent 1, and Swedish accent 2. In nouns, the prefix bears main stress, and German, Dutch, Swedish, Norwegian, they're all basically accent 2. Yeah. So the prefix to nouns that Swedish and Norwegian borrowed bore main stress on the prefix in the donor language. This fits into the normal Germanic compound stress. And the borrowed prefix nouns were easily adapted into the system following other inherited prefix to nouns which behaved like Germanic compounds. So the history of the verbs is different. Although both present-day Swedish and Norwegian have two sets, one with unstressed prefixes and stressed prefixes, you get the following. The original ones, unstressed prefixes, were lost by the end of the Old Norse period, and they're all borrowed. They all have accent 1 and treated as nonesuch. But if you had the secondary stress on the prefixes, the varying patterns did not exist in Scandinavian. Later Swedish, of course, reanalyzed all compound-like words with initial stress. But the verbs have not changed. The unstressed prefixes remain as they are. Yeah. So Scandinavian languages extended their pattern of marking nonesuch words by specifying them with accent 1 from their trading partners. They traded more than just the goods. So now let's turn to initial geminus, which is another marked category. This comes from Swiss German. So Notker der Labe or Notker der Deutsche, whichever way, he apparently had thick lips, that's why he was called Notker der Labe. Swiss German has word initial geminus, which is very, very unusual in Germanic language. It's very unusual in the world's languages, let alone in Germanic. So there were new development largely as a consequence of loans. So in Scandinavian, like a Scandinavian tone, a marked contrast was increased. Why? First of all, this is what it looks like in Swiss German nowadays. If you have something like pommes frites, which is borrowed and it has an underlying geminate, it's long closure duration, short VOT. I don't like beans, which is not borrowed, it has a short CD. So it's a typical geminate distinction in initial geminate. And you don't see it in the, unless you have a preceding word, you don't see it, of course, but you can measure it in palatography, the initial geminate, that the amount of closure is longer. Yeah. Acoustically, you can't, of course, see it if it's silent. So what Notker did was the following. 1,000 years ago, he devised his own alphabet, and the orthography reflects his pronunciation. What he did was he wrote BDG word initially after sonorants, PTK after plosives and fricatives. Now, if you see something like this and you give it to Phonology 1 students, they would naturally immediately say, this is allophonic, not phonemic, right? I mean, this is completely. So the same word begin in Augen beginnen with a B and ich beginne with a P. Similarly with the verb gehen, sunnagat, ferostgat. Yeah. More examples come from here. This is begin, and this would be beginner. You can read again. Looking carefully at the manuscripts, you can see that. Sometimes even the word God was also changed from G to K, would alternate, and those later editions just got rid of it because God couldn't be with a K. So, feroskat, you have a K there. Sunnagat, same verb, same tense, once G, once K. I'm saying not the sound but the letter deliberately. T with the preceding G, or D with the preceding vowel. So this was not, there was no exceptions to this. Well, it's not true there's no exceptions. If you look at it a little more carefully, suddenly you find an exception. And the exception comes for particular sound. So not because consonant phonemes, if they came straight from Germanic, you would assume that you had geminates and you had singletons, and that's what he would write. So basically it seemed as if there was no voicing contrast in the language, where finally he always used a voiced letter. Okay. So why? Well, first let's look at the exception. So you had, this is normal, you would get a T preceded by a G, but suddenly you get a T, the same word, tag, preceded by an R. This is the corresponding word today in English. So unexpected letter. Was he making mistakes? Well, he wasn't the type to do that. I mean, he was very systematic. But you look at it, and there are no exceptions to these either. So if you put it all together, then you realize that what was the phonological contrast? Why did these T's suddenly, in a handful of words, differ, such as like tag, but not like tas and das? Well, the quantity was probably not, the contrast was not voicing, but maybe quantity, which was a perfectly reasonable assumption, and why, we see in a minute. So the assumption is that this is actually a quantitative contrast which has survived. A very odd one, but indeed. Well, if you look at the West Germanic, West Germanic had geminates and singletons and voicing contrast. The pre-Old High German system suddenly decided to change all the voiceless stops into voiceless affricates. So no voiceless stops to begin with, no voicing contrast. The contrast is gone because all the voiceless stops are become affricates. So whatever these letters may be, they're certainly not indicating voicelessness. But what happened to the interdental fricative? Well, that is probably, if you lost the fricative status, we hypothesized it became a t. It was not unusual. Many of the languages have done that. But now you get a clash. So this clash, we argued, was resolved by making it a geminate. Now, is this all made up, or is there any reality to this? Well, if you look at the modern Swiss German now, take Notke's words, all the words that alternated, looked at the ones that survived in Swiss German, and of course they don't alternate now, they're all single consonants. But when you look at the ones with the non-alternating ones, like tak, or anything which was originally actually a D, so tak, tochter, so if you compare English original D-like words like day and daughter and can't think of any anymore, then you're going to get this Swiss German geminate. So that's essentially what you ended up. But modern Swiss German has all of them in all the contrasts agree. The Notke only had one, and that was the coronal one. So where did they come from? And you know we have them because you get these contrasts. But look at the words which have underlying geminates. They all are, again, loans. Why? Well, if you looked at systematically at all the words that, other than the T, that were with per and k, and what you find is that these are inherited, they are underlying singletons, and these are underlying loans. Now, when we are doing this, I mean, this has later research in our lab and elsewhere, and this is not something other people have argued for this as well. People have noticed that these were long and short. Whether it's lenis fortis or long or short, the question was that this was a particular set which increased in contrast where Nootka did not have it. So the consonantal quantity contrast existed in word initial coronals, only in coronals, and they extended this contrast to other places of articulation. And the marked contrast now increased to word initial geminates as well. As we will see, this is not unusual. Again, same pattern, different output realization. Moving on to feature contrast, the last bit, also involving coronals. Here the claims are the phonological grammar can override pure phonetic overlap. So place features, this is again claims made by Kenstowitz or Larry Hyman and others, unlike the ones that have been purely phonetic overlap, like Papercamp. And the claim over here is a little more big, that place features override manner features and pertinacious nonesuch segments prevail. What I will look at is a particular consonant, and we're coming to that in a minute. Let's take it from Indo-European down with just these coronal consonants. The red line is inherited, blue line is loans. Sanskrit to Bengali, well, I mean, several centuries, of course, but okay, pretty much direct. Greek to later Greek, the th, which was not a fricative originally, became a fricative. Germanic th, remember, the English survived, nobody else did. The exact state of voicing is not the issue over here, the fricative didn't survive. The Germanic ter, which Dutch and English had a ter, whether it's aspirated or not, that's another issue. The German had a ts. Yeah, that at least is parallel. If you had a Germanic der, then the English and Dutch had a der, German had a ter. Basically, the Germans didn't like to keep the consonants as they were. They made a huge number of changes. Whether it was the mountains or not, I do not know. There were lots of hypotheses about it, but basically they didn't like them. And believe it or not, English was very conservative. They kept it, yeah. So the crucial examples, like if you compare Old High German, the dri to three and so on, or danke, denken, danke, whatever, to think, thought, etc. Dry to three. Bengali, of course, shows the voiceless one. Then comes the loans, later Greek th, English th. Okay. English th became German s, and Bengali th. Dutch and English th became Bengali retroflex. Romance th became Bengali dental. And last but not the least, we are concentrating now only on the th. That's too much else to go on. So consonants changed all over the place. The loans were also all over the place. Question is why? So let's take a look quickly at the loan history. Well, Old English loans from Latin, Middle English loans after normal conquest, of course, early modern English loan, Romance and Greek, and modern loans, Romance and directly from Greek. German and Dutch, Latin and Old French, their loans came in much later, so they had different kinds of effects, particularly in the stress. And you see this because the stress rules, but like the ity suffixes for English, the classic ones, they came in very early in English, while they came in much later in German and Dutch. So you get things like university versus Universität. This is very, very typical difference. Okay. Now in Bengali, loans came in 15th century from Portuguese. Now, if you remember the Scottish history as well a little bit, so Charles II, when he finally got over his father's head being chopped off, etc., was very clever. He married Catherine de Braganza and thereby got hold of Bombay. So that was the handover from the Portuguese. Portuguese had a very big establishment in India. They handed it over to England, and England became part of this. Then somehow the Portuguese managed to come to Bengal. Mind you, Bengal is on the east coast, right? So and Goa and Bombay are on the west coast. So they managed to get there. And so you got lots of loans from Portuguese, which are completely part of the language, followed by French. and massive influx from English, of course. So the interesting thing is that English th became Bengali dental aspirate, German sir, Dutch ter. English ter became Bengali retroflex. And now to remind you of the historical development, the Proto-Germanic th had a different pattern of change, normal change. From Portuguese, you had a different pattern. Portuguese dental, or Portuguese T, let's say they only had one. Bengali dental, the English one, Bengali retroflex. The sir was always the palato-alveolar, and the cluster was always palato-alveolar. And then you suddenly see another alternation with the ST clusters. Same, even similar words, but you get a different pattern in Bengali. Question, why? So just to remind you of the types of contrast, the English and Portuguese both have one set of coronals, Bengali has two, in the stops at least. Fricatives, again, English and Bengali have two. Well, English has two, Portuguese has two, Bengali really has one. So Portuguese loans came into Middle English in the 15th century. In fact, the earliest literature talks a lot about pirates. The Indian literature does not discuss pirates. They discuss flying over, you know, the big birds which took you over from one place to lots of ships sometimes, but no pirates. The pirate literature came in when the Portuguese came in. That was very interesting, I thought. Nobody made a comment on that. But now, if you look at these words like chave, chabi, pau, ruti, armai, so if you know any Romance languages, these will sound familiar too. And these are English loans, all very beautifully, ter, sh, etc. Now, we looked at certain, of course, the Portuguese, like all the Europeans, kidnapped many young men, particularly, took them to Portugal. Some of them became missionaries, and one of them came back to India. And then you got these dictionaries formed based on the Latin bilingual dictionaries. And they are available in British Library and SOAS. And they look sort of like this. There's not a dictionary, but a vocabulary collection book for missionaries. And the entries are not grammatical regularities. Yes? So Bengali glosses added in Bengali script by informants, and the handwriting is so difficult to read. So it's sort of, this is the kind of thing that you look at, just to show you what one has to go through. I'm going to give you some words which are interesting, like chapa is to press, and that was definitely that. Shaban, which is soap, very fundamental part of the language, saban. One of the words that struck my attention was balti. Now it's balti in Bengali. And of course, the first time I went to a balti restaurant in Birmingham with a friend, I couldn't believe my ears when I was hearing balti. You mean I'm going to eat from a bucket? So, you know, basically that's what it means, a bucket, right? So it's hardly an Indian word. It's borrowed from the Portuguese, very much part of the language. And there you go. So, and pronounced with a th, of course, balti. Kolapata, botam, very fundamental words. Okay, fine. Now, these are the English alveolar plosives have all been retroflex, and the th is dental aspirate, theatre. Now, the sibilance, just before we talk about the analysis, the sh is the primary fricative. So all, but it will become a dental when a dental follows. So koshto, then mosto, krishno, but shusto, etc. So it always assimilates across the, so if you have kashlo, but kashbe, but kashbe. That's important because we will see clusters give us a further clue as to what the original sounds could have been. So initially, Bengali only likes, in Sanskritized words, a consonant cluster, but you would normally put like Spanish, you would put a vowel in before, so station becomes ishtishan, school becomes ishkul, slate becomes shelet, so either prothesis or epenthesis. Now, Again, just more sibilance, you've seen enough, but what I want to add is the last bit. If you take a look at the Portuguese mestre is mistri, the same word master is mastar, exactly the same words, estirar, istiri, maestro, mastul, but register is registar. Yeah. So absolutely consistently, dental sir, dental t from Portuguese, palatal-alveolar sh, palatal-alveolar t elsewhere, but not initially, not before other clusters, not before word initially, they're always the palatal-alveolar. So what is it that's going on over here? So the dental to dental mapping is clear. Why is aspiration ignored in the voiceless stop? Why is the th borrowed as a stop? And how does one explain the clusters? So if we look at the phonological features more carefully, then we will see that if you assume that place features dominate, then that becomes clearer. So I'm going to assume the full features over here, and one brief way how it looks. So there is no dependency over there. The combination of place, the articulators and the tongue height give you the, so there's no plus minus distributed, there's no plus minus anterior. It's a question of combining the high-low. This one just doesn't want to work anymore. Ah, there it goes. These two with this gives you the palatal-alveolars. And this was what it would look like. So if you think of the place, the tongue height features, you have a dental and a retroflex, you need something to distinguish it, that's high. If you have two stridents, you distinguish that. If you have the continuants are just, and the stridents are just plain stridents. So the point I want to make over here is that given that Bengali has two plosives, you need to distinguish with low and high. Yeah. And why is it the case that the interdental fricative changed to aspirated stop? Well, the coronal low non-strident features match the phonological representation of th best. So translating continuant to spread glottis may be a phonetic match, but not this. So the th to th is essentially combining the place features, having a low. The only low thing that English has happens to be a fricative. And that's the only one that Bengali has. There is no way you can make that into a sh, because that's going to be definitely high. That will not be equivalent to the th. If you take the strongest support comes from the fricatives. So if you remember, all the shs are Bengali shs, all the sibilants initially, but as soon as you have a cluster, you don't. So that changes, because if you have coronal and high strident, that becomes a sh to that. That's initial. But as soon as you have a cluster, you get a low plus a low, that gives you a low, and you get a high plus high, that gives you a high. That's absolutely consistent. That cannot be explained purely by a phonetic match. Yeah. Okay. And the last thing is English th becoming German sir, but Dutch t. Why? Again, there was an eye-tracking study by Hanulikova and Weber who tried to do mispronunciation study. They substituted th with fur, t, thief, 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 thief. And they realized, would all mispronunciations guide German and Dutch and English listeners to look at the real word? No. What they found was that the Dutch preferred T substitutions to th, but the Germans preferred the s. Now, if you don't believe me, let me play you something. Essentially, th to s, right. So what you get is the following. So these are all coronals, of course. Th, s are low because you have to contrast it with the high. German has two fricatives, you contrast it with low. There is nothing, and the high strident is there. So if you match it down, coronal and low, and German s, and that's the best match. Dutch does not have it. It does not have a low-high contrast. It simply gets rid of the fricative, as was done before. That is essentially what happened earlier. Okay, so same pattern, different feature outputs again. I'm not going to do this. It's not important. The German, the ths remained as they are. The Germanic th, just to show you that the Germanic, non-Germanic th was really borrowed as a t first into English. They were all, they were not a th. They were pronounced as a t. It was much later that they became a th. So the spelling pronunciation, no, it wasn't a spelling, but the direct loans from Greek and our knowledge of these loans changed the t to th. So the modern ones are th, but otherwise they're all and then great, big, large increase now of the th, marked th words come from all medical vocabulary. So if you look into the arthritis, I mean, the huge numbers, about 200 words in the last 3 decades, basically. Okay. So loans with foreign patterns, adaptation is not as simple as a phonetic match. First, the contrast is difficult to perceive. Second, if it were only perceptually similar, different speakers would have different patterns. If the phonology did not play a role, then the native grammar would have no influence. So influx of loans rarely changes the grammar of an adult unless they deliberately set out to do so. The generation acquiring the language would need to absorb the loans into the grammar. So a ruler pattern may persist over time, same pattern, different output, and if you have persistence of output forms, the phonological grammar may change like the Swedish did, different patterns, same output realization. And these are my colleagues who have helped with, in fact, did most of the work. Thank you very much.